Did you ever wonder if a suitor in the Middle Ages was actually a threat in disguise? What if their supposed devotion was just a clever scheme to get at your family's land? Or perhaps their secret passion was something the church would condemn to the deepest pits of hell? Number 6. Lack of dowry or property. In the cobbled streets of medieval Paris or the sprawling manors of England, the concept of a dowry for a young woman was not merely a tradition. It was a cornerstone of a potential marriage. A dowry was the property or money brought by a bride to her husband upon their marriage. It could be land, livestock, household goods, or even specific amounts of coin. This was not a gift to the groom for his personal enrichment, but rather a contribution to the new household, managed by the husband for the benefit of his wife and any future children. The dowry served several crucial functions within the intricate web of medieval society. Firstly, it provided a form of financial security for the wife. Should her husband pass away, the dowry often reverted to her, or at least a portion of it, providing her with the means to support herself and her children without becoming a burden on her birth, family, or the community. It also served as her share of the family inheritance, given that women typically did not inherit land directly in many regions, unless there were no male heirs. The absence of a dowry, therefore, immediately raised questions about a bride's future well-being. A young woman without a dowry was seen as bringing little to the marriage, potentially making her a burden rather than a partner. Parents, guardians, or even the young woman herself might worry about how she would fare if her husband died or if the marriage faced difficulties. Such a situation could hint at her family's own financial struggles, a lack of care for their daughter's future, or an attempt to marry her off quickly without due diligence. Records from church courts and manorial rolls often show cases of dowry disputes, highlighting their importance in the legal and social fabric of the time. For a man, the equivalent was the possession of land, a profitable trade, or a position that guaranteed a steady income. Blacksmith with a well-established forge, a tailor with a bustling shop in the town square, or a knight with a productive estate were all considered desirable matches. Their ability to provide for a family, to maintain a household, and to uphold their social standing was directly tied to their economic capacity. A suitor who boasted of grand plans but had no tangible assets, no land of his own, or no clear apprenticeship in a skilled trade often drew a skeptical eye. Parents would typically inquire deeply into a potential son-in-law's economic prospects, consulting with local merchants, guildmasters, and even the local lord's bailiffs. Letters from parents to their children or prospective in-laws often detail negotiations about the specifics of the dowry or the groom's assets, showing how thoroughly these matters were examined. A young man who was seen to be living off the generosity of others, or who frequently changed professions without settling into one, might be perceived as unstable. His lack of a fixed income or a recognized trade meant that he could not reliably provide for a wife and children. Such a situation could signal an irresponsible nature, a lack of discipline, or even a hidden debt that prevented him from establishing himself. Historical accounts from families navigating marriage alliances often emphasize the importance of a groom's established wealth or his clear path to acquiring it. Chronicler Jean Froissart, in his extensive narratives, frequently mentions the lands and holdings of nobles and knights when describing their eligibility for marriage, demonstrating that even at the highest echelons of society, property was paramount. The marriage contract itself, meticulously drawn up and often witnessed by legal officials or church representatives, would typically lay out the exact details of the dowry and the husband's financial obligations. If a dowry was conspicuously absent, or if the man's means of support were vague or questionable, the legal protections for the wife and the stability of the union were compromised from the outset. This lack of clear financial backing, whether from the bride's side or the groom's, often led to quiet disapproval and a general sense of unease among the wider community. It was not merely about wealth for wealth's sake, but about the fundamental ability to sustain a family unit and maintain the social order. Number 5. Too much chaperone or too little. In the medieval world, the concept of a young woman's honor and reputation was paramount, often linked directly to the honor of her entire family. This was especially true for those within the nobility or the burgeoning merchant class, where alliances and inheritances hung in the balance. As such, the presence of a chaperone during interactions between unmarried individuals was not just a suggestion. It was an unbreakable social rule, a silent sentinel guarding a maiden's virtue and her family's good name. Typical arrangement would involve a maiden's lady-in-waiting, a trusted elderly relative, or a servant of long standing, always present during any meeting with a suitor. These chaperones were not merely spectators, they were active participants in the social dance, ensuring that conversations remained appropriate, that physical contact was minimal and proper, and that the young woman's reputation remained untarnished. Letters and conduct books from the era, such as the Book of the Knight of La Tour Landry, written for his daughters, consistently emphasize the importance of modest behavior and the dangers of unchaperoned interactions. A suitor who found his potential bride always surrounded by watchful eyes, even during seemingly innocent encounters at a feast or a public gathering, would understand that her family was diligently protecting her. This was the expected honorable way of courtship. However, an excessive amount of chaperoning could raise a different kind of eyebrow. Imagine a scenario where a young woman, perhaps the daughter of a wealthy merchant, was never seen without a veritable retinue of guardians. Not just one trusted aunt, but 2 stern-faced cousins and a watchful governess, even when simply walking through the town square or attending a church service. This level of oversight, far beyond the customary, might hint at a deep-seated distrust within the family itself. Was the maiden known for being overly flirtatious in the past? Had there been previous scandals or indiscretions that her family was desperately trying to prevent from reoccurring? Perhaps the family was hiding something about her temperament or her past behavior, something that would be revealed if she were allowed even a moment of unsupervised interaction. Such an extreme level of control, while ostensibly for protection, could also signal a family's attempt to control a situation that was already on the verge of spiraling. The suitor might quietly wonder if he was getting involved with a family with hidden secrets, or a young woman who was difficult to manage. On the other hand, the complete lack of a chaperone for a young woman was a glaring signal of trouble, a social faux pas that screamed volumes about her family's regard for her honor or their social standing. A maiden who was permitted to wander freely, to engage in unchaperoned conversations with young men, or to meet a suitor without proper supervision, was immediately subject to harsh judgment. Her reputation, and by extension, her family's, would be irrevocably tainted. Such behavior implied that her family was either too poor or too neglectful to provide her with the necessary oversight, or worse, that they simply did not care about her virtue. In rural communities, gossip traveled faster than a rider on a swift horse. A young woman seen alone with a man, even for a brief moment, could find her name sullied throughout the village. For a noblewoman, the stakes were even higher. An unchaperoned rendezvous could lead to accusations of illicit behavior, jeopardizing potential marriage alliances with powerful families, and potentially ruining her prospects entirely. Historical records from manorial courts and church courts sometimes show instances of women accused of unchaste behavior, based on testimony regarding their unchaperoned movements. A suitor, looking for a respectable wife who would bring honor to his own family name, would find a young woman without proper chaperoning highly undesirable. It suggested a lack of proper upbringing, a disregard for social norms, and a potential for scandal that he certainly would not want associated with his future household. The balance between customary protection and overbearing control, or between respectable freedom and scandalous abandon, was a delicate one, and the way a young woman was chaperoned spoke volumes to the discerning eyes of medieval society. Number 4. Otterbay, disregard for church, law, or local customs. The medieval world was profoundly shaped by the pervasive influence of the church. From the grandest cathedral to the smallest village chapel, its laws, doctrines, and moral teachings permeated every aspect of daily life, especially when it came to something as fundamental as marriage. Marriage was not just a social contract, it was a sacred sacrament, blessed by God and overseen by His earthly representatives. Therefore, any clear disregard for church law or deeply ingrained local customs surrounding courtship and matrimony was a significant cause for alarm. One of the most critical church laws concerned consanguinity, the degree of blood relation between prospective spouses. Church, in its efforts to prevent incest and promote broader social alliances, prohibited marriage between individuals related within certain degrees, often extending to the seventh degree of kinship, which could encompass distant cousins. While these rules were sometimes bent or circumvented through dispensations, a suitor who openly scoffed at or deliberately ignored such prohibitions was inviting serious ecclesiastical censure. Marriage between close relatives without a dispensation could be annulled, rendering any children illegitimate and potentially disinherited. Court records from bishops' tribunals are replete with cases concerning prohibited degrees of marriage, showing the Church's vigilance on this matter. A suitor who pressured a woman to marry despite known kinship, or who himself came from a lineage already embroiled in such an illicit union, carried a heavy burden of potential scandal and legal quagmire. Beyond consanguinity, the Church also emphasized the concept of consent. While arranged marriages were common, especially among the upper classes, the Church insisted that both parties must freely consent to the union. A suitor who used coercion, threats, or undue pressure to force a woman into marriage, or who attempted to establish a pre-contract without her genuine consent, was treading on dangerous ground. Such actions were not only morally reprehensible, but could lead to the marriage being declared invalid by ecclesiastical courts. Stories of forced marriages, especially for inheritance or political gain, appear in historical chronicles, often depicting the tragic consequences for the individuals involved. A family observing a suitor employing such tactics would rightly be concerned about the future happiness and validity of their daughter's marriage. Local customs, while perhaps not carrying the same weight as church law, were equally important in maintaining social harmony and respectability. These could include specific rituals for courtship, the proper exchange of gifts, or the accepted periods for engagement. For instance, in some regions, it was customary for the suitor to formally request permission from the bride's father or guardian in a public setting. In others, a formal betrothal ceremony, often involving the exchange of rings and vows in front of witnesses, was almost as binding as the marriage itself. A suitor who bypassed these established customs, perhaps trying to elope without parental blessing, or attempting to conduct secretive meetings away from the community's watchful eye, was signaling a disregard for tradition and a potential inclination towards deceit. Villagers often had a strong sense of communal order, and a breach of established norms was viewed with suspicion. Folk tales and local legal records often reflect the importance of these rituals in establishing legitimate unions. Furthermore, public morality, heavily influenced by church teaching, dictated appropriate behavior between unmarried individuals. Open displays of affection, or any behavior that suggested a lack of chastity before marriage, were severely frowned upon. A suitor who was known for being overly forward, for engaging in suggestive banter, or for attempting physical intimacy before the wedding, was seen as lacking moral fiber. Such a reputation could harm not only his own standing, but also that of the woman he pursued, casting a shadow over her honor. Preachers regularly delivered sermons condemning lust and impropriety, reinforcing these societal expectations. A suitor who consistently ignored these foundational rules, whether divine or customary, indicated a volatile and perhaps untrustworthy character. such a person might be prone to breaking other rules, causing scandal, or creating legal entanglements that would plague the new household. For a family seeking a stable and honorable alliance, a partner who showed such disregard for the bedrock principles of their society was inherently problematic. Number 3. Rumors of witchcraft or heresy. In the medieval landscape, where faith was the bedrock of existence and the church wielded immense power, accusations of witchcraft or heresy were not mere whispers of gossip. They were declarations of ultimate betrayal against God, king, and community. The very air seemed to crackle with fear and suspicion regarding such matters. A suitor, or indeed anyone, associated with even the faintest rumor of these dark practices was not merely undesirable. They were a profound danger, a walking harbinger of doom. Witchcraft, or maleficium, was believed to involve invoking demonic powers to cause harm, whether through illness, crop failure, or personal misfortune. While the widespread witch hunts of the later centuries had not yet reached their terrifying peak, local communities harbored a deep-seated fear of those who practiced hidden arts. If a suitor's family had a history of strange occurrences, or if he himself was known to spend unusual amounts of time in solitude, perhaps in forests or forgotten corners of the village, whispers would begin. A sudden illness in his presence, an unexplained accident involving his livestock, or even a dispute that seemed to result in bad luck for his adversary, could all fuel such damaging rumors. Local chronicles and court documents, especially from manorial or ecclesiastical courts, occasionally record cases where individuals were accused of using spells or charms, even if the charges were rarely as formalized as later witch trials. The repercussions of such accusations were immediate and devastating. Persons suspected of witchcraft would be ostracized from the community, denied communion by the priest, and potentially face severe penalties, including imprisonment, torture, or even death, particularly as secular authorities became more involved in enforcing religious conformities. It meant inviting not only social ruin, but also divine wrath upon the entire household. It implied an association with the devil, a stain that would cling to one's name and lineage for generations. No family, particularly one concerned with its standing and spiritual well-being, would willingly tie itself to such a cursed fate. Heresy was equally, if not more, dangerous. Heresy was defined as belief or opinion contrary to orthodox religious doctrine. This was not a minor disagreement, it was a fundamental rejection of the Church's authority and God's truth. Movements like Catharism in southern France. If a suitor was known to question church dogma, to secretly read forbidden texts, or to associate with groups deemed heretical, the danger was immense. Perhaps he spoke openly about translating the Bible into the common tongue, or suggested that priests were not truly necessary for salvation, or denied the existence of purgatory. These were not intellectual debates for a medieval villager. These were treasonous thoughts against God. Consequences of being associated with heresy were absolute. Heretics faced excommunication, forfeiture of property, imprisonment, and often death by burning at the stake. Their families could also suffer immensely, their lands confiscated, and their reputations utterly destroyed. A suitor rumored to be a heretic was a direct threat to the safety and survival of any family considering a union with him. Their children would be branded with the shame, their spiritual salvation imperiled, and their material possessions vulnerable to seizure by the authorities. The Church, through its network of bishops and inquisitors, was relentless in rooting out heresy, and records from inquisitorial tribunals document in chilling detail the consequences for those accused and their associates. Even if the rumors were unfounded, the mere whisper of such an association was enough to shatter a reputation beyond repair. In a society where social standing and communal acceptance were vital, to be linked to witchcraft or heresy was to be cast out from the folds of humanity itself. A family would avoid such a match as they would avoid the plague, for it promised not only a troubled marriage, but spiritual damnation and utter destruction. Number 2. Family feuds, or social exclusion. In the medieval era, an individual was rarely seen as an isolated unit. Their identity, their status, and their very safety were inextricably bound to their family. The family, whether a vast noble lineage, a prosperous merchant clan, or a humble peasant household, served as a protective shield, a source of identity, and a network of support. Therefore, a suitor whose family was embroiled in incessant feuds, or who was himself socially excluded from the community, represented a profound and often insurmountable obstacle to a stable and desirable marriage. Family feuds, especially among the nobility, were not mere arguments. They were protracted, often violent conflicts over land, honor, or power, sometimes spanning generations. A suitor whose family was constantly warring with a neighboring noble house, perhaps over a disputed boundary or an ancient insult, meant a lifetime of instability, danger, and potential bloodshed. Young men from such families might be expected to participate in raids, ambushes, or open warfare, putting their lives at risk. The families of prospective brides would be well aware of such conflicts. They would assess whether linking their lineage to a feuding house meant exposing their own daughters and future grandchildren to danger, disruption, and potentially revenge attacks. Chronicles from the period, like those detailing the Wars of the Roses in England or various regional conflicts on the continent, paint a grim picture of the devastating consequences of such prolonged animosities, often involving confiscation of property, imprisonment, and death. Even in smaller, more localized communities, feuds between peasant families or merchant guilds could erupt into bitter rivalries, affecting trade, access to common lands, or even social interaction. A suitor whose family was known for its litigious nature, constantly dragging neighbors into manorial courts, or engaging in petty but persistent quarrels, would be seen as bringing discord into any potential union. Life in a medieval village depended on cooperation and communal harmony, and a family that consistently disrupted this peace was viewed with suspicion and resentment. Records from local courts often detailed disputes over land, animals, or verbal insults, illustrating the depth of these local conflicts. Beyond active feuds, social exclusion was equally problematic. This could manifest in several ways. A suitor who was an outcast from his own community, perhaps due to a past transgression, a dishonorable act, or a perceived moral failing, lacked the essential social capital necessary for a stable life. Perhaps he had been caught cheating in a trade, or had been publicly accused of a crime, even if acquitted. His isolation meant he lacked the support network that was vital for survival in medieval society. There was no one to lend aid in times of need, no one to vouch for his character, and no one to stand with him in a dispute. This often meant he was without access to credit, unable to participate in communal projects, and generally shunned by those whose goodwill was necessary for a thriving household. Furthermore, social exclusion could stem from physical or mental infirmities that were poorly understood and often stigmatized. While charity existed, individuals with visible disabilities or perceived mental instability were sometimes marginalized, and a suitor from such a background might face significant societal hurdles in securing a respectable marriage. Similarly, belonging to a minority group that faced prejudice or discrimination, such as certain ethnic groups or religious minorities in specific regions, could also lead to a form of social exclusion, making marriage alliances with the dominant group challenging and often fraught with difficulties. A family considering a suitor from a feuding lineage or one marked by social exclusion would recognize that they were not just marrying an individual, but inheriting a legacy of conflict, isolation, or shame. Such a union promised a life devoid of communal support, constantly overshadowed by external threats or internal strife. It was a clear sign that a life with such a partner would be anything but peaceful or secure. Number 1. unexplained wealth, or sudden poverty. In the medieval economy, which was largely agrarian and highly structured by tradition, sudden shifts in fortune were rare and often viewed with deep suspicion. Wealth was typically acquired through inheritance, successful harvests, a long-established trade, or the patronage of a powerful lord. Likewise, poverty was often the result of predictable factors like crop failure, disease, or a devastating fire. Therefore, a suitor who displayed unexplained wealth, or who had recently fallen into sudden, inexplicable poverty, was a source of grave concern, hinting at hidden dangers or illicit dealings. Consider a suitor who, despite his family's known modest means, began to display an array of fine silks, imported spices, or even acquired a new plot of land seemingly out of nowhere. His father, perhaps a simple miller, might suddenly possess a larger herd of cattle than his neighbors, or his mother might flaunt gold rings that no one had ever seen before. In a society where most transactions were transparent and local gossip spread quickly, such unexplained prosperity was unlikely to go unnoticed. Villagers, accustomed to a fixed social order and predictable economic cycles, would whisper questions around the well or in the marketplace. Where did this new wealth come from? One of the most common suspicions would be usury, the lending of money at exorbitant interest rates. The Church strictly condemned usury as a grave sin, viewing it as a form of exploitation. While some people engaged in it discreetly, particularly Jewish moneylenders who were often reluctantly tolerated for this purpose, open or excessive usury by Christians was met with condemnation and could lead to excommunication. If a suitor's family was rumored to be engaging in this forbidden practice, it would cast a dark shadow over their moral standing and spiritual well-being. Records from church courts frequently deal with cases of usury. Another possibility was theft, banditry, or even piracy, especially in coastal regions or along busy trade routes. A man who suddenly had too much coin for his station, or who mysteriously acquired valuable goods that seemed to appear from nowhere, could be involved in illegal activities. The law enforcement of the time, whether the local lord's bailiff or the king's sheriff, was often crude but watchful. Association with criminals meant not only moral opprobrium, but also the very real risk of arrest, imprisonment, or even execution, with the potential confiscation of all assets. Accounts from local legal proceedings occasionally reveal instances of such illicit gains. Furthermore, unexplained wealth could stem from corruption or illicit dealings within the local administration, perhaps from a bailiff or a reeve skimming taxes or extorting payments. While powerful individuals might get away with it for a time, such practices often ended in public disgrace and ruin when discovered. On the flip side, sudden poverty, when there was no apparent reason, like a bad harvest, a widespread plague, or a fire that consumed a home, was equally alarming. A once respectable family that quickly lost its land, its livestock, or its standing might have been ruined by crippling debt, perhaps incurred through gambling or poor management. They might have been involved in a failed business venture or lost a legal dispute that resulted in the forfeiture of their assets. Perhaps the head of the household had been involved in an illicit affair that led to social ostracization and loss of income, or they were stripped of their tenancy for failing to meet feudal obligations. The absence of a clear, understandable reason for such a dramatic change in fortune suggested a hidden problem. It could point to a family curse, a profound personal failing, or involvement in something deeply dishonorable that led to their downfall. In a society that valued stability and continuity, both unexplained riches and sudden destitution disrupted the natural order and implied that the suitor or his family was either engaged in risky, immoral, or illegal activities. A marriage to such an individual was a leap into an uncertain future, fraught with potential scandal, legal trouble, or financial ruin.